I must have repeated this about 5 times in my video ranking every zone in Sonic Mania, but it really is astounding how not bad that game is. I like the classic Sonic games enough, but each of them are so inconsistent with the quality of their zones, to the point that you can have the best zone in the entire game, only to subsequently play mediocrity. And while that was mostly fixed in Sonic Mania, it's an issue with basically all these games, and I think that includes Sonic the Hedgehog 3, aka the one everyone likes. Yes, this is an inconsistent game. It has some of the peak moments of the entire series, but also some of, well, not the worst moments, but a lot of really boring moments. So, looks like my Mania video is a series now, and in this video I'll rank all the zones in Sonic 3 and Knuckles from worst to best. This whole series can be like a little retrospective look at Sonic, only the order isn't even close to being chronological. The biggest factor I'll take into consideration in making these rankings is how fun I found the acts of the zone to be, but visuals will absolutely play into it as well. Also, since this is Sonic 3 and Knuckles, I'm going to be approaching it as one game and judging zones accordingly. Although, they are still technically two separate games, making reviewing their zones a bit complicated. So just know, in the case of something like Mushroom Hill Zone, I'll first and foremost be looking at it like a midpoint zone, but it also is the first zone of Sonic and Knuckles, so I'll consider that a little bit too. Also, I do think when you're playing through the whole game in its entirety, it does feel like there are some differences in design philosophy between Sonic 3 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but that's a topic for another day and not really relevant. With that said, let's get into the worst, most stinky, doo-dooest zone in the entire game, Marble Garden Zone. I had an earlier version of the script, but I actually abandoned it and stopped playing. That was entirely because of Marble Garden Zone. This is only the third zone in the game, and it's already so tedious and annoying, and whenever I play this game, the zone will more often than not make me stop. Thank God for the zone select sheet. This zone is the first of many in the game to feel tricky. It's a zone where you have to figure out the levels to progress at times. This can be switches changing the terrain, tops you need to run on, or even a seemingly infinite spiral at the beginning. This can be fun in some instances, but here it feels more arbitrary, and the amount of speed traps feels endless. This is not a fun way of tripping you up, and the zone just feels like it's punishing you at every turn. It's only the third one. That endless running bit at the start feels like the only memorable part, and even that's kinda already in other zones too. The zone honestly just feels like a mess, and it's tiring to play, if anything. I get exhausted by this, and to add insult to injury, you get the worst boss in the game at the end. This was already a bad enough injury. The insult is like really nasty. It even managed to sneak in jab at your mother in there. Usually the bosses aren't really needed to mention in these zones, but here it sucks so bad. Sorry, Tails, but whenever you're helping me fly, or I'm in your plane, the level just sucks ass. It's so hard to get rings back after hitting Eggman, and his hitbox is so weird with the most random parts being the ones to deal damage. I don't like this boss. And the visuals of the zone are kind of bright and saturated. I like them enough, but meh. Another zone that is tricky like this is Sandopolis Zone. Sandopolis is so weird, because the first act is decent. It's an average but forgettable level, and the only thing I really did remember is when you could loop yourself around multiple times instead of just one. That was fun. If the next act was like that, I think I would have put it a bit higher, but no. You go into a big-ass pyramid, and it was so annoying. There's a gimmick where you need to keep lights on, or ghosts will get you, which is fine on its own, but you have to manage it alongside frequent timed doors, sand filling up the pyramid, and more, meaning you have to keep track of tons of things, and it's just a really, really long level. You'll probably run out of time at least once. I do think this had a lot better moments than Marble Garden Zone, though. It feels pretty cool that you're discovering this cool pyramid, and there are multiple moments where you like grab a rope and scale down a column and stuff. Those are pretty memorable. The booby traps and things were too pervasive for me to properly enjoy them, though, and again, it's very tedious. It's not that great, but the first act and some more exciting moments prop it up from being the absolute worst zone. The next zone is the final zone of Sonic the Hedgehog 3, and technically the middle level, because again, Sonic 3 and Knuckles is sometimes weird to talk about as a whole. Launch Base Zone. The reason I bring this up is because this does not feel like a last zone at all. It's the world's okayest zone. I played this game just yesterday, and I don't even remember anything about it at all. The visual of the Death Egg is imposing, and about the most memorable thing in the zone, but it feels a little disappointing when this isn't the zone before Death Egg Zone. It makes me think this was originally meant to be in Sonic and Knuckles or something before being shifted to Sonic 3. I would not be surprised if that was the case at all. Gameplay-wise, there are these switches which control platforms, and that's about all I remember. It's not bad or frustrating by any means, but not that good. The boss at the end is pathetically easy too. It would be probably disappointing if you were to play just Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on its own. This is also the point where I think we're officially done with the overwhelmingly tedious zone, so that's good. Pretty good. Funnily enough, the actual final zone is right after Launch Base in our ranking. It's Death Egg Zone. This one's also okay. It's not really the most memorable, but it absolutely has more cool things than Launch Base Zone, which makes it better to me. I mean, it's worth it for the song at the final boss alone. Visuals definitely have a unique atmosphere too, and this zone feels sinister in a way. There are parts where you go upside down too, but those were a little annoying. I don't have that much to say on the final zone of the game. This and Launch Base Zone are probably the C tiers of the game, if Sandopolis and Marble Garden are the D tiers. Next up, Mushroom Hill Zone. Mushroom Hill is a solid zone. It's very simple and doesn't feel as compact as something like Angel Island Zone, which was the first zone of Sonic 3. But in the game, filled with some pretty frustrating moments, it's nice to have a simpler zone to give you a break in the middle point. What makes it cool, though, is the theme. A forest of gigantic mushrooms is just a really cool visual, and they do it well. This might be a nitpick to me, though, but I feel there were missed opportunities gameplay-wise. Using the mushrooms to bounce isn't really used, which could have been unique for the Sonic series, and just thinking about how much more stuff they could have put in the zone is exciting. There's also a part late into Act 2 where the season changes a couple of times, but that never really affects the gameplay. Could have had like the Banjo-Kazooie thing, you know? There are much more missed opportunities than outright flaws, though. Mushroom Hill doesn't have as much as I would have liked for sure, and it's not as fun to try to look for secrets and whatnot, but it's not launch-based levels of meh. My next ranked zone is Lava Reef Zone, and can I do the lazy thing here? Sure. Okay, go watch the Sonic Mania video. Seriously, there are a couple zones there that come from Sonic 3 and Knuckles and a return in Sonic Mania, those being Hypno-Sissy Zone and Flying Battery Zone. And these are probably more similar to the Mania incarnations here than Lava Reef is, but I have basically nothing new to say on this, so I'm gonna be lazy and say watch that, okay? That's not an insult, by the way. To be clear, I do like this zone, but it's not exactly important enough that I think I need to double dip on talking about it. Sorry. I do think Sonic and Knuckles' version of the zone is quite a bit weaker than Mania, though, just because it's a little more confusing to navigate, for lack of a better term. Next best zone is Sky Sanctuary Zone. Results are for the Sonic Generations version. I feel like that kind of shows how memorable it was in the game it actually debuted in. It's a shorter zone, and what's most memorable about it is definitely the visuals, being up in the sky. This isn't a competition, but it's definitely better than Launch Base Zone. Except this is a ranking, so it is literally a competition. Some sections played up the platforming elements of it, though, and the amount of precision felt unwanted for Sonic. Save that shit for Sonic 1, please. My favorite part was the fact that you get a bit of a boss rush against bosses from previous Sonic games, such as the boss from the end of Green Hill Zone from Sonic 1. I imagine if one would do the really annoying sounding task of marathoning each Sonic game one after the other in one day, that could be a very pleasant end to the experience if you haven't got insane already. Next up, Angel Island Zone. Angel Island is a really cool first zone. It has a perfect amount of little secrets that are hidden away, but it leads you on enough to make them easy to find. The first Chaos Emerald Ring is a good example of this. Angel Island Zone feels compact, And not only is it a good way of introducing you to the Sonic format, it's a great introduction to Sonic 3's changes too. With its more open and longer zones, it might just be a little too slow paced during Act 2 when the water starts rising. Sonic 3 in general kinda has too much water. Haha, IGN reference. But that isn't exactly this zone's fault. Halfway through the first act, Eggman sets the whole goddamn place on fire, and you play through a burning hellscape. It's a great bit of storytelling, and it's actually pretty powerful visual. I kinda wish we got more when the place wasn't on fire. Maybe it could have been actually changed in the transition to Act 2. I don't know, I just kinda like the forest look. Those things are nitpicks though. Angel Island is already designed pretty well. There's even an abundance of stuff like swinging ropes that makes it just a blast to play on. And you basically get a crash course on power-ups too. When you get a fire shield, that lets you avoid damage from fire and stuff, so it's cool that the zone is good at introducing you to these. My next choice is probably going to be the most controversial choice I've made. I've looked at community rankings and it's always been placed at like C tier at highest. Carnival Night Zone. Yeah, I actually like Carnival Night Zone. It takes a lot of time to get used to, because it's a very much a slower zone, and it has very minimal enemies. It's more of a puzzle, and it feels like a race against the clock to try to figure out elements of the stage and overcome it. It's for that reason I didn't really mind Insta Crushes here as much, emphasis on as much. Barrels are really dumb though. Like, we all know this, but there was no indication how you're supposed to control them. Anyways, it's very likely you'll run out of time if you aren't making an effort to go quickly, and I like this aspect. I wish a race against the clock was a thing in more Sonic games. Of course, it does ring a little hollow when the clock is completely reset by one death, but that could have very easily resulted in soft lock, so I'm glad that's still a thing. Also, it's kind of hard to see the level sometimes. Maybe it's just because I played the Sonic Mega Collection version on my GameCube. Very much not HD, but it was sometimes hard to differentiate the black background and colorful, carnival-y elements. Just figure out the stage thing, though, was kind of part of the fun. I can understand people disliking this zone, but I'm a fan. And now, we are at the top 3 best zones in this game. The last zone from Sonic and Knuckles, Flying Battery Zone. Flying Battery Zone is Sonic blown up to an extreme. The main design philosophy has always been fast-paced fun sections as a sort of reward for slower sections, and in Flying Battery Zone, both things are to an extreme. Platforming sections are slower than normal, and you'll sometimes have to wait for these platforms or swing from pole to pole. That platforming section is also pretty annoying when it's always an insta-death, and it's a complete momentum stop. I'm not the biggest fan of it. Those speedy sections are so much fun though. They feel way faster and more chaotic than anything else in the game, and the fact that you're so high up means it's just so much more fun in general. The pace-breaking slower sections definitely feel like a flaw though. Finally, it's time for the other controversial zone, Rhinoplasty Zone. I always see this lower on the tiers people make, and honestly, I don't even get why people say that. It's an excellent balance of that Sonic quality I mentioned before, but way better than the Flying Battery Zone. Platforming sections have more of a margin of error than they normally do, which makes it forgiving and satisfying. Since they're underwater, of course, they're slower, which actually makes it pretty fun. Some people would complain about drowning, but it's not that big of a deal because it's very easy to get to air, unlike literally every water-themed zone ever. The really fast sections are some of the best in the series, which makes it so much fun in all parts. I also like the presence of the bubble shield, because that can affect gameplay in a really fun way, given you get bouncy and stuff. Hyper DBZ Zone is the second zone in the game, and it does a great job with that, given how it introduces you to power-ups, and the slower sections of the Sonic series. Unfortunately, it also does have one or two really questionable decisions, which I feel like I just had to mention. Like, why is there a switch with a spike on it? And I don't know what the hell they thought they were cooking with the beginning of Act 2, but those feel minor compared to the flaws in other zones. And plus with the Act 2 thing, at least they had a one-up at that part for Mercy. With that, we are at the final zone I'll talk about here, which is the absolutely legendary zone. There's no surprises placed so high, Ice Cap Zone. Ice Cap Zone has the trickiness of Marble Garden Zone, but actually good. Frequently on your journey through this zone, there'll be these sorts of puzzles you need to sort through, especially on the first act. Something like that infinite spiral, where you need to do a well-timed jump to get on an ice block, that sort of thing. I've talked before about how Sonic's slow-paced platforming juggled with fast-paced sections, and Ice Cap Zone has this. But those slower-paced sections are still fast, and they flow together naturally, making it seamless, like it's the perfect zone. Get it? Flow. This zone also has a few enemies, which puts the focus more on speed, but it still has plenty of obstacles to make it interesting. Actually, the second act is more of a traditional Sonic Zone too, which makes it feel varied. The theme and music are what make this zone so iconic, though. The snowboarding section at the beginning, nothing short of legendary. If you don't think Sonic snowboarding is badass, what the hell are you doing watching so much of a video on Sonic in the first place? The crystalline ice caverns and bright blue skies are atmospheric, and some may say it looks generic, but hard disagree. There's just such a pervasive sense of freedom looking through these caves and a certain whimsy to these mysterious caves that I don't think that feeling has been captured in the Sonic games since. There's also a sense of isolation. This zone also probably inspired Press Garden Zone, my favorite Mania zone, since that's the same ice snow dispenser things. I guess ice levels aren't that bad when you take away dumb slippery physics. The part I remember all these years later though, it has to be the music. It's not the cherry on top. It's so good, it's like a separate dessert piled onto your ice cream. It's so poppy and feels the scene so well. Too bad it was plagiarized, but the theme was so good, I kinda wish Sega would just risk getting sued just this once. I still find it really funny that Michael Jackson met Yuji Naka. I'm getting sidetracked. Ice Cap Zone is incredible in so many ways, and it's a highlight of an already amazing game. Sonic 3 was a huge step forward for the franchise, and a good enough send-off for this era of the franchise. It always felt to me like a big priority of this game was to be bigger, with huge, sprawling zones filled to the brim with secrets that are way bigger than anything in the series before, and themes for those zones that branch out and try new things often too. That said, some zones inevitably do end up being way worse than others, because, let's face it, this is classic Sonic. That stuff happens a lot. It's mostly because they're tedious, rather than complete bullshit. I use the term bullshit level design a lot when talking about these games, but that applies more so to like Sonic 1 and 2, and by god the adventure games, than this particular classic Sonic game. But that does not mean it's immune to having frustrating parts. Sonic 3 and Knuckles is much too flawed for me to call it a masterpiece, but a game doesn't need to be a masterpiece to be well designed, and it is a real work of art in its higher moments, and that's the title I think it deserves. I almost do wish we could have gotten one more Sonic game in the Genesis era of this format, except for like Knuckles Chaotix, just to see how much more polished and expanded this new format they added to the Sonic games could be, but I am more than happy with the Sonic series, more or less taking the next step after this game. I have no idea what Sonic game I'll rank in the zones next in a while when I decide to make another video in the series. Maybe I'll go further back and do Sonic CD or 2, or maybe Knuckles Chaotix, or even a non-classic game like Sonic Adventure, even though it doesn't have zones. No idea, so it'll be a surprise when I do, I suppose. Also, I just realized competition mode has exclusive zones, but they don't have zone in their name, so they don't count. Also, no way am I counting Doomsday Zone, so don't tell me that in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Get blue balls on Hypnocity Zone.